Hi folks, I am Alan Watt and we're cutting through the matrix. Just mentioning there about Leo Strauss, who lectured at MIT, I believe, and he was a mentor of a whole bunch around George Bush Jr., who believed in a form of perpetual war, that the public must never be let in on what's happening. And he also believed in a noble lie, that they all believe in that at the top. It's nicer for a psychopath to call it noble. It makes them feel a little bit better, and they must always boost their ego. But they call it the noble lie. Whatever lie is plausible enough for the public should be used. And it's always for a good purpose, you see, which is, of course, whatever their agenda happens to be. That's the reality of the world in which we live. We're out of the picture. And we are in the 21st century. The 21st century, and when you think about it, you've still got cabals of bankers running everything. Cabals of them in secrecy. At one time you're called a conspiracy nut if you talk about the bankers and etc., how they ran things in secrecy. Even those official history books out there to tell you how they run things in secrecy, including how even the Rothschilds, when they took over the Bank of England, made a deal with the British government and wrote it into law that their books would never be opened. They'd never pay any taxes. And no one would have a look at what they brought in or put out. That still holds good today. What a deal, eh? It's good work if you can get it, eh? But here's an article here from Bloomberg on this topic, in fact, of bankers. The 21st century, and we've got secret cabals running whole nations. It says here, the secret banking cabal emerges from the AIG shadows, by David Riley, January 29th. The idea of secret banking cabals that control the country and global economy are given amongst conspiracy theorists who stockpile ammo, bottled water, and peanut butter. That's what he thinks of people who, I guess, outside of himself, who talks about conspiracy. After this week's congressional hearing into the bailout of American International Group, Inc., you have to wonder if those folks are crazy after all. Wednesday's hearings described a secretive group deploying billions of dollars to favored banks, operating with little oversight by the public or elected officials. We're talking about the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, whose role as the most influential part of the Federal Reserve System, apart from the matter of AIG's bailout, deserves further congressional scrutiny. The New York Fed is in the hot seat for its decision in November 2008 to buy out for about $30 billion insurance contracts AIG sold on toxic debt securities to banks, including Goldman Sachs Group Inc., Merrill Lynch and Company, Societe Generale, and Deutsche Bank AG. Amongst others, that decision, critics say, amounted to a backdoor bailout for the banks, which received 100 cents on the dollar for contracts that would have been worth far less had AIG been allowed to fail. That move came a few weeks after the Federal Reserve and Treasury Department propped up AIG in the wake of Lehman Brothers Holdings Inc.'s own mid-September bankruptcy filing. And he goes on to saving the system. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner was head of the New York Fed at the time of the AIG moves. He maintained during Wednesday's hearing that the New York Bank had to buy the insurance contracts known as credit default swaps to keep AIG from failing, which would have threatened the financial system. The hearing before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform also focused on what many in Congress believe was the New York Fed's subsequent attempt to cover up buyout details and who benefited. By pursuing this line of inquiry, the hearing revealed some of the inner workings of the New York Fed and the outsized role it plays in banking. This insight is especially valuable given that the New York Fed is a quasi-governmental institution that isn't subject to citizens' intrusions, such as freedom of information requests, unlike the Federal Reserve. See how it's all wangled out? So they always do everything in secrecy. This impenetrability comes in handy since the bank is the preferred vehicle for so many of the Fed's bailout programs. It's as though the New York Fed was a black ops outfit for the nation's central bank. Well, it's getting closer to it. Next about Geithner's bosses. The New York Fed is one of 12 Federal Reserve banks that operate under the supervision of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors, chaired by Ben Bernanke. Member bank presidents are appointed by 9-member boards, who themselves are appointed largely by other bankers. As Representative Marcy Kaptur told Geithner at the hearing, a lot of people think that the president of the New York Fed works for the U.S. government, and that's the impression they try to give you, right? But in fact, you won't for the private banks that elected you. You work for the private banks that elected you. Private banks, that's who they work for. And yet in the New York Fed, it played an integral role in the government's bailout of banks, often received surprisingly free rein to act as it saw fit. Consider AIG. Let's take Geithner at his word that a failure to resolve the insurer's default swaps would have led to financial Armageddon. Given the stakes, you might think Geithner would have coordinated actions with then Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, yet Paulson testified that he wasn't in the loop, meaning in the know. I had no involvement at all in the payment to the counterparties, no involvement whatsoever, Paulson said. And they didn't waterboard them either. They don't get that. Bernanke's denials. Fed Chairman Bernanke also wasn't involved. Nobody's involved, you see. In a written response to questions from Representative Darrell Issa, Bernanke said he was not directly involved in negotiations with AIG's counterparty banks. Quite something, eh? What's the point of having a hearing at all? Back with more after this break. Hi folks, I am Alan Watts and we're cutting through the matrix, reading an article by Bloomberg on the Federal Reserve and the shenanigans that they got up to and still get up to all the time, and how they keep everything so secret in this 21st century where they control trillions of dollars and we're all jumping at their whims and we're all suffer for every action that they do. It's all secretive because we're so progressive in this day and age. But it says here, you have to wonder who was really in charge of our nation's financial future if AIG posed as great a threat as Geithner claimed. Questions about the New York Fed's accountability grew after Geithner, on November the 24th, 2008, was named by then-President-elect Barack Obama to be Treasury Secretary. Geithner said he recused himself. That means you cut yourself off from your previous affairs. He said he recused himself from the bank's day-to-day activities, even though he never actually signed a formal letter of recusal. Same when politicians run for office, they're supposed to leave all their financial dealings and stock shares and all that in the hands of a lawyer and not ever to discuss it with them till their term is over. But they, of course, they do. That left issues related to disclosures about the deal in the hands of the bank's lawyers and staff rather than a top executive. Those staffers didn't want details of the swaps purchase to become public. New York Fed staff and outside lawyers from David Polk and Wardle edited AIG communications to investors and interviewed with the Securities and Exchange Commission to shield details about the buyout transactions, according to a report by Issa. That the New York Fed, a quasi-governmental body, it's private, public-private, was able to push around the SEC, an executive branch agency, deserves a congressional hearing all by itself. Later it became clear information would be disclosed. New York Fed legal group staffer James Bergen emailed colleagues saying, I have to think this train is probably going to leave the station soon, and we need to focus our efforts on explaining the story as best we can. There were too many people involved in deals, too many counterparties, too many lawyers and advisors, too many people from AIG to keep a determined Congress from the information. That's what the guy said. Think of the enormity of that statement. A staffer at a body with little public accountability, and that exists to serve bankers, is lamenting the inability to keep Congress in the dark. This belies the culture of secrecy obviously pervasive within the New York Fed. Committee Chairman Adolphus Towns noted during the hearing that the bank initially refused to disclose even the names of other banks that benefited from its actions, arguing this information would somehow harm AIG. Penchant for secrecy. In fact, when information was finally released under pressure from Congress, nothing happened, Towns said. It had absolutely no effect on AIG's business or financial condition, but it did have an effect on the credibility of the Federal Reserve, and it called into question the Fed's penchant for secrecy. Now, I'm not saying Congress should be meddling in interest rate decisions or micromanaging bank regulations, nor do I think we should all don tinfoil hats and start ranting about the Trilateral Commission. I don't see the connection. Yet when unelected, accountable agencies pick banking winners while trying to end-run Congress, even as taxpayers are forced to lend, spend and guarantee about $8 trillion to prop up the financial system, our collective blood should boil. But I got to laugh at inquiries because they go nowhere. I've seen so many inquiries in my lifetime. Apart from spending on a lot of tax money, they really don't go anywhere. They copied this system from Britain and the British Empire because they still have these inquiries going on today. Endless inquiries. Some of them will take 10, 12 years, and by that time, everybody's forgotten what it was, and nothing comes of it. It's just a farce. Right now, there's one of these famous inquiries going on to do with who was to blame for getting the Iraq invasion started. Well, everybody knows, who's got a memory of what happened, but they have an inquiry about it now. And it's so interesting, too, that David Kelly, who was one of the main witnesses there to testify, and he was part of the group for inspections and all that in Iraq. They had no weapons of mass destruction, and of course he was suicided in a field, and the second autopsy proved that he did not commit suicide. And now that that's been that information has officially by the British government been classified under the Official Secrets Act for 70 years. So we can't know what killed them for 70 years. And it happened just 2 days before Tony Blair was due to go up on the bench and give his part of the testimony as to what happened in the war. How fortunate for Tony. No wonder he's always smiling.